Hey, it's week 2. We're going to dive into what you need to know for assignment 2 here. And again, given that, conversations that you and I have had suggest that you've had some experience with these things, I understand that a bit of what I'm going to talk about here will potentially be a repeat of stuff you already know. It'll be review, I suppose. But maybe I can get a little more in depth with some of the technical stuff here that maybe you did or did not receive before. I can't be certain. But I do want to stick with what would have been. Well, let me explain. In the classroom, when we have this class as a regular photography class, the assignment that I'm giving you right now would have been split up over 2 assignments, and I'm making it into one, right? So we can maybe jump into some stuff that may interest you a bit more. I don't know, in the next assignment. And so we're going to talk about using the aperture and the shutter speed, right? These are 2 points on that exposure triangle that we talked about last week. We're going to talk about their main functions, right? Controlling how much light enters the camera and for how long, but also the additional attributes that come with that. Namely, let's just go ahead. Namely, we're talking about indicating motion and capturing depth of field. I'll talk about what both of those mean as we dive in. This particular lesson is going to specifically be on using your camera's aperture to control depth of field. All right? So, some quick terms. You may be familiar with these, but we'll still define them nonetheless. Aperture is simply a hole or an opening through which light travels. More specifically, aperture of a camera is the opening that determines the cone angle of light that comes to a focus inside of the camera body. So, why did I set that down there? All right. Oftentimes, when you've got a good DSLR with a nice size lens on it, you look down into there and you can see that aperture opening back behind the lens. I'm sure you're familiar with this already, but that's going to control the amount of light that gets into the camera body back here. The F number, or f-stop, is a number that corresponds to the ratio of the system's focal length to the diameter of the entrance pupil. All right? That sounds... That definition's very technical sounding. I'll get to what that means in a moment. Depth of field in optics, particularly as it relates to photography, is the distance between the nearest and farthest objects in a scene that appear acceptably sharp and in focus in an image. Right? Depth of field is that depth that we feel like within the image, everything within that particular depth is in focus. Things beyond it may be out of focus. Things that are nearer may be out of focus. But there's this certain depth at which everything feels nice and acceptably in focus. All right, so if we sort of look at this diagram, it's a very simplified diagram of a camera. Every camera is essentially made up of 2 parts. The camera body, within which is the light-sensitive material, whether that be film in a film camera or the sensor in a digital camera, the shutter, all the electronics, right? All that stuff is in there. And then the lens, right? The lens generally is going to contain either a fixed lens or one that is a lens array, which is what I have in mind, that allows me to move this ring here, and right, it's switching between at the widest an 18 millimeter on mine, and at the most tele at a 55 millimeter, right? But it's not as if there's a 55 millimeter lens in there and an 18 millimeter lens, and it's just switching those out, right? There's an array of lenses that get moved apart or closer together to mimic the results that you would get from an 18, a 35, a 45, a 55, etc. Right? That's in there. The focusing ring is usually in the lens. Not usually, it is always there. That's where you're going to have your focusing ring. I have mine set. Let's take that off of auto, and I should be able to turn it now. Yeah. And our focusing ring. There's the switch that lets me switch this from automatic to manual focusing. And the aperture is usually a part of the lens. If I remove this, well, yeah, I can sort of see it down inside there, but it just occurred to me as I was doing that even if I held this really close to the camera, you're not really going to be able to be able to see it. But it's in there, right? In the case of a DSLR, you're going to also have in the camera body, well, you may not be able to see it. Let me see. There. That mirror. That mirror is the thing that's bouncing the image that comes from the lens into the camera body up to this right here, so that I can see what's happening outside there. In a camera that just shows you the image that you're seeing on the LCD screen, or LED screen rather, that mirror may not be in there. But in a dual lens reflex, that kind of a DSLR, that'll usually be in there. And I said dual, I meant single lens reflex. Yeah, if you've never known what that stood for, DSLR, it's digital single lens reflex. So called because a single lens reflex has a single lens. I don't have a dual lens one in here, do I? Unfortunately, I don't think I do. If I was back in my office at work, I have one. But anyway, in a dual lens reflex camera, you're going to have two lenses. There's one through which the photograph is actually going to be taken, and there'll be a secondary lens above it that is the lens that provides what you see through your viewfinder, right? So that they're ever so slightly offset from one another. This is going to allow me to see exactly what the photo that this camera is going to take will look like. In a dual lens, right? The main lens is only affecting the film usually. Usually a dual lens reflex is going to be a film camera. And then the top one is just ever so slightly offset. So the picture never looks exactly like what you saw when you were looking through the frame. All right, so aperture is this opening at the back of the lens. A wide opening allows in more light. That's going to be what we call low F number or low F stop, like an F3.2, and narrow opening equals less light, or a high F number, like an F11. Now, that seems counterintuitive, right? The larger the number, like here we have a 2.8 through a 16, the smaller the hole, right? But the reason for that is that an F stop is actually represented as a fraction, where F stands for the focal length of your lens. So if I have a 55 millimeter, let's say, right? And then that is divided by, that's what this is, the number that you see. So A 16th of this 55 millimeter lens is, of course, going to be much smaller than what is nearly a half, or nearly a half, like maybe close to a third, right? With the 2.8. Right, that's the reason for that. It's something that I notice confuses a lot of beginning students. You said you have been shooting manually for a long time, so it's probably something that you already understand. But just know that the aperture, like we see here, is generally controlled by several fan blade kind of things that sort of twist and open up or close down that aperture. And we refer to as, if we open it up, we refer to that as stopping up. If we are closing that aperture down, we refer to it as stopping down. And what we see here, 2.8, 4, 5.6, 8, 11, 16, these are some of the original standards. Now, a lot of digital cameras nowadays have lots of little extra stops along the way. But in the early days of photography, when everything was trying to get as standardized as possible, what they tried to do was to make everything where it was in magnitudes of 2. Meaning, as we'll see when we get to, we'll talk about ISO in a later lecture, but you'll see that each ISO is meant to either double or half the ones before or after it. So you go from 100 to 200 to 400 to 800 to 1600, and each one's doubling the one before it, and each one is half the one after it. Right, 100 is half of 200, there, and so on. In the aperture, each of these is roughly half the one before it. So an f2.8 cut in half is roughly an f4. Cut in half is roughly a 5.6. Cut in half is, right? Each one is doubling or halving the light that you would get from the one before or after it. Right? So you're going to get twice as much light with a 2.8 as you would with an f4. You're going to get half as much light with an f4 as you would with a 2.8. Right? Meaning that if the shutter speed is left alone, right, you keep the shutter speed at exactly the same speed, but change your f-stop for each of these shots here, each one is doubling that amount of light that gets into the camera, and ergo each one is twice as bright as the one before it. Right? But the aperture setting comes with an additional attribute, and that is depth of field. Now, the depth of field, right, we refer to in a few ways. We refer to what is called shallow depth of field. Shallow depth of field is where a very narrow portion of the depth between us and whatever else is in the image is what's acceptably in focus. It is extremely narrow. We call that shallow depth of field. So, and we get shallow depth of field when our f-stop is when our aperture is open to a really high f-stop. So, like here with the f4, when we have our shutter wide open, when we have our aperture wide open, I'm recording this kind of late, by the way, I'm tired. That wide open aperture has difficulty getting good, sharp, crisp focus on everything that's in front of the camera. So we can get something like this, where we have a scene here where there's whatever it would be between the camera and the person with the bicycle, and then there's all of the landscape beyond, and we could get just this person with their bicycle in focus. Then there's what we call sort of, I've heard it called a few things. I've heard it called median or medium depth of field. You get that from something like an f8, right? That's where most of what's in front of us is acceptably in focus, but get far enough away and those things go out of focus. And then at an f/22 or even smaller, because some cameras can get even smaller than that, but that f/22 is just a pinprick of an aperture. We can get what is referred to as infinite depth of field. So there's shallow, medium, and infinite depths of field. Infinite means that the closest things to the camera feel like they're nice and sharply in focus, and stuff as far as can possibly be seen by the camera, even that stuff out there, feels acceptably in focus. It may not be perfect, right? If you were to zoom in super tight on that stuff out there, it's not like you're going to have all kinds of perfect detail out there, but it feels acceptably in focus. That is what we refer to as infinite focus. So again, a small aperture, like an f/22, we get a large depth of field, which allows us, if we have these three squirrels nice and perfectly lined up in front of the camera, we can have all three of them in focus. A shallow depth of field, which we get with a large aperture, allows us to have a shallower depth that we could just choose one. In this case, this person has chosen the middle one, but we could have chosen the front or the one in the back, right? We could turn that focus ring and get the specific one that we would like to have in focus. All right, so here's the exact same setup, it looks like, that has been shot with two different f-stops. One at a 2.2, one at a 9.5. Now you may look at the two of them and be like, well, they don't, one doesn't look brighter than the other. I would assume that someone is, whoever has taken this photograph adjusted their shutter speed in order to get the same exposure for both. But with an f/9.5, they were able to get all of these, glasses in focus. And the blinds just beyond, but then if we get just beyond the blinds out there, whatever was out there, you see starts to go out of focus. With this 2.2, right, they were able to get this one specific glass in focus, and everything closer to us and everything beyond it goes out of focus. It's very shallow, right? It is shallow enough to just allow that one thing to be in focus. Reasons we might use something like that, right? In a photograph where we want emphasis, we might want shallow depth of field, right? Where we want to have this whole table of billiard balls, but we want there to be emphasis on this 8 ball right here. So very shallow depth of field. And I always enjoy when there's something like this table that we get to see in something that has really shallow depth of field, because it's really fun to scan up it and watch the table go out of focus as you move away. Right? You can see this really sharp focus, the texture of the velvet, not velvet. My brain won't come up with the term for what that is. I mean, we'll call it velvet. And then we watch that as we move away become less and less in focus. We watch the everything blur as it moves away. Right? This is I forget the photographer, but this was a photojournalist. This photography was going along with a story that was relating a story that this particular woman who's being interviewed had told, and this item that factored into the story that she was telling was being held up. So that particular item becomes important in the story. The photograph that's meant to accompany the story then uses this really shallow depth of field so that we get just her hand and the object, and then everything else kind of goes out of focus so that we get a certain emphasis. Our eyes are drawn to that thing. Right? This person doesn't necessarily seem to be trying to give us emphasis, but there's a fun playfulness, if you will, to having all of these objects lined up and having really only one of them feel really good and in focus. Maybe this Charlie Brown figure is sort of in focus, but not as well as this one is. And certainly as we move the ones beyond and even closer, those go out of focus. Or something like this. This was a this photographer clearly wants to point out, I think this may be an ROTC group, wants to point out just how young this one particular individual is, right? And so, putting in a very shallow depth of field, focus just on this one person who's so short, his eyes barely come above the shoulder of the person in front of him, right? And like that's the kind of image. That's a pretty powerful image, and the emphasis and the focus becomes there. Versus times when it would be more acceptable to use infinite depth of field. Like this, where this person, this photographer doesn't want to just showcase this dancer, right? This dancer is taking part in a parade. And so they want the dancer, sure, but they want the environment. They want the people who are there to see this. They want the ambiance of where this is taking place. They want us to see that there's water out here beyond. They want us to see all these umbrellas and all of the people who are here for it. The buildings suggest something about the town or the city that we may be in, right? So we want infinite depth of field so that everything from the person who's really close to us, to the road, to the people beyond, to the landscape, to these trees, to these buildings, to the water way out there, everything feels nice and in focus. It doesn't feel like there's anything that we're being told we should focus our attention on. Clearly, yes. Clearly, this is our main focus, the dancer here. But we're being told that because of placement, because of color, because of the space that's been given around her. This may be a him. Right? That's what's telling us this is the focus. Not by taking other attributes of the composition and blurring them out. Or, say you're wanting to shoot some pier that goes really, really far outward away from you. It makes sense to have something like this in infinite focus so that you've got nice, sharp focus on the boards that are nearest to us. But when we get way out here, that's all nice and in focus as well. And even all the way out to the horizon feels at least acceptably in focus. So, assignment number 2. You should already have gotten this in your Google Classroom feed, is to make 8 images. 4 images that are going to experiment with interesting effects of depth of field, and 4 that are going to experiment with blurred or frozen motion. I'll talk about that in the next lesson. Then I'm going to ask you to photograph or edit these photographs in color. So there'll also be some lessons that are going to come up that'll help you in creating strong effects of color. So I want you to employ those. All right. So when you go out and shoot your images for this, you can set your camera on aperture priority mode. Now, if you really want to continue to shoot manually, that's fine. The reason I say to put this in aperture priority mode, which in your camera, I don't know how well that's showing up, but that would be right there where it's pointed at the A. This is going to allow for you to change the aperture on your camera. And I mean, you said you like to shoot manually, so I assume you know how to change your aperture on your camera. If, however, you're not certain, let me know. Yeah, I'm sitting here with an icon. I can explain how that's done. But it allows you to adjust your aperture, and then the camera will adjust the shutter speed. So you don't have to think about that. But if you really want to think about that and keep it in manual, that's fine. But your main focus in this first part of this assignment is to think about your your aperture, and change your aperture up and look for interesting effects of depth of field with a variety, right? Get some shallow, get some medium, get some infinite depth of field, right? So let's look at some examples from students in the past. right? This student with this like tassel that's hanging down, they get the tassel and the number on it very sharp and crisp in focus, and the depth of field is so shallow that everything beyond is out of focus and blurred. This student just trying to get the bee and this blade of grass or whatever this is, and I said bee. That looks like, I'm not sure what, like a sweat bee, a hornet. I don't know what that is. This insect, and then everything beyond it, as you can see, out of focus, but not like there's some stuff right here, like this blade that isn't like super out of focus. So this is shallow, certainly, but it's not like so shallow that the only thing that's in focus that feels acceptably in focus is this. But pretty immediately things go out of focus. This person who's taken their human subject of the photograph in the background and has made them blurry by having a wide open aperture and getting only this little branch that's up close, nice and crisply in focus. This is the same student getting this shoe down here and the concrete step just beyond it, other things that are acceptably in focus, and then pretty immediately everything else goes out of focus. This person with this bug right here, but again, everything beyond is out of focus. And really, right, like where the bug itself is on the whatever this was, this piece of concrete or whatever it was, that's in focus. Come out here and things get ever so slightly blurry again. This person, right, just experimenting, not really looking for, not worrying so much about a perfect composition. Although this kind of works, but this student had taken several photographs of this long line of swing sets, trying to get different ones to be in focus. Then this student working with infinite focus to get this barn that's falling down, right? But again, infinite focus. So the grass that's near us feels nice and crisply in focus. The building itself does, the tree beyond, and even way out there, that feels, decently in focus. The same student, like this was kind of interesting, used kind of a medium depth of field because they didn't want just this plant, right? Because this is a perfect photograph to use a shallow depth of field and just get this plant right here in focus and then get everything else beyond it out of focus. But what they wanted was for you to see that there's this like lively, alive thing in the middle of a building that's just falling apart and dying, if you will. And so they wanted everything within it to feel in focus. This person with infinite depth of field having this long road and the stuff out there feels like it's just as well in focus as anything near us does. So the next lesson we'll talk about using your shutter speed to either freeze or blur motion. All right, see you then.